Recently, a UN-affiliated NGO called UN Watch released a top 10 list of the most dangerous countries going into 2020. And we know that at this point, the UN is basically nothing more than a tool of Western imperialism, as are many NGOs. So, a UN-backed NGO, I highly doubt they're telling the truth here. Let's investigate some of these countries that they're telling us we need to watch out for, or maybe more accurately, that they're telling us we need to go after. At number 10, we have Russia. Wow. I cannot say this comes with a shock. The liberal media has really hopped on the whole Russiagate thing. They seem to be wanting to start a new Cold War with Russia. All the world's problems, according to Rachel Maddow, CNN, and MSNBC, seem to be coming from Putin and Russia. You know, everything Trump does is apparently part of some master plan by Putin, despite the fact that Trump has increased troop presence around Russia, so an escalation, and the fact that he's sanctioned them for their support of Assad in Syria, who the U.S. also wants to overthrow, who we've been trying to overthrow for years, and for he sanctioned Russian natural gas firms who tried to trade with Venezuela, another U.S. state enemy who's going to appear later on this list. And wouldn't you know it, they're buddy-buddy with China, and Russia has, they're moving back more towards the Soviet model. 75% of Russians say they wish they could return to the economic model of the Soviet Union. More state-owned industries, more social programs, more protections for workers. And we know the U.S. doesn't like. And the reason UN Watch gives for why Russia is dangerous is their support of the pro-labor Lukashenko, as well as their support of Assad in Syria, just like you thought, as well as some various human rights abuses that happen in Russia, which of course are wrong and we condemn. But that's not the reason they're dangerous. UN Watch is saying they're dangerous because Russia is challenging the West economically. All right, on to the next one. Number 9, North Korea. Wow. I mean, this is just proof the U.S. has given up on conquering Kim Jong-un in North Korea. The fact that they're not number 1 on this list, they're like, we'll deal with them later. Let's go get Syria. Oh my gosh, this Cuba one is the most hilarious. So first they're accusing Cuba of blocking medical aid, which of course the U.S. did to Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba themselves during the pandemic. Their horrendous human rights abuse is arresting a rapper, and they're saying they sent doctors abroad as slave labor. Cuba was sending doctors out to help other countries who were struggling during the pandemic because Cuba was doing so well. They have just over 100 COVID deaths. They've been tracking and tracing the disease since it began because they have an abundance of doctors, because they have free education. And you're saying they're sending them abroad as slave labor when the U.S. has prisoners who are working literal slave labor jobs in a pandemic with no protections. And you're saying Cuba is a worse human rights abuser because they sent doctors abroad to help. You know, in Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro said the Cuban doctors were slaves and he sent them away. And then when the pandemic started, Jair Bolsonaro asked for the doctors back because Brazil's hospitals couldn't handle all the infected patients. These aren't slaves. Cuba's not a bad country for sending doctors around the world to countries who are struggling with illness. That's a good thing. And Cuba's doing a good job handling the pandemic. Next. So Saudi Arabia comes in at number 5. And I noticed this is the second ally of the West to come in on this list. And the countries they chose were Turkey and Saudi Arabia, 2 major U.S. allies, and 2 countries with primarily Islamic governments and Islamic people. Because if you're doing propaganda in America, and you want to say, hey, we're accusing allies of the West of being bad too when they do human rights abuses, they pick the Middle Eastern countries to prey on people's biases. At least that's my suspicion. But yes, what Saudi Arabia is actually doing a lot of human rights abuses. We're sponsoring their war in Yemen, which is giving the people of Yemen cholera. There have been war crimes committed, like the bombing of their water sanitation facilities. So very bad, but also very interesting that UN Watch, this NGO here, chose to select 2 U.S. allies for this list, and they are both Middle Eastern nations. So number 4, Venezuela. And people who know me know how mad this makes me, that Venezuela is being accused of causing their own humanitarian crisis, causing the refugee crisis in their country. Venezuela has an oil-dependent economy because British Petroleum and Dutch Shell extracted oil out of their country for years and years and years. They became oil dependent. They developed what's called Dutch disease, where all your other industries lag behind your oil. Hugo Chavez came to power, tied social programs to the oil, and now the U.S., after Chavez's death, have 155 economic sanctions on Venezuela, starving them out, including in a pandemic. And Iran tried selling them oil, and the U.S. intercepted the oil and stole it. Literally took the oil and brought it back to the U.S. for ourselves. We are causing the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. There are critiques to be made of Maduro, but they are not the authoritarian nightmare here who is causing death and suffering around the world. The United States are, and they are causing the death and suffering in Venezuela. Hands off Venezuela. It's a cause I care very deeply about. So yeah, screw UN Watch for this one. This one made me angry. Number 2, Iran. Iran has been a target of US regime change and Western regime change for a long time now. They've refused to play by the rules. And of course I have critiques of Iran. Of course they're not a socialist state. They reject socialism and capitalism. They say both are against their religion. They're a theocracy, an Iranian state, which essentially means much of their industry is state-owned, publicly owned, and a lot of their economy is centrally planned. And it's worked pretty well for them. They have, great universities, an incredible intellectual tradition in Iran, which is so sad that the neocons and the neoliberals want war with this incredible country. Not to say their government is incredible. They execute people. They executed a wrestler, actually. And of course, totally disagree with all of that, but we know the disaster that war with Iran would bring, the same kind of disaster that came from war with Iraq. So they'll give you the individual human rights abuses of Iran. They'll play them up like these things never happened in the United States. And it's all in an effort to create a disastrous war, which would destroy people in Iran and the United States. So I'm not surprised they put Iran at number 2. And number 1, of course, China. The number 1 reason for China is their treatment of the Uyghurs, which China has multiple times invited the UN and other NGOs to investigate in the Xinjiang region, and the UN has repeatedly denied it. Yet here a UN-affiliated NGO is talking about the Uyghurs as if it is the most atrocious human rights abuse going on maybe ever in the history of the world. They're number 1 on the human rights abuses list. So given how bad that is, I would like you guys to go investigate it and report back to us here in America so we can know how bad it really is. Because when China invites you to investigate and you don't, from the outside looking in, it sort of looks like everyone's just mad that economic power is shifting from the West to the East. And that's what the UN is actually upset about, that China just signed the largest trade deal in history and it didn't include the US. The fact that they're doing developmental loans and trading with all of the countries on this list, with Iran, with Venezuela, with Russia, with all these U.S. state enemies. It's starting to seem like that, so I wish you could go investigate and just figure out what's going on there, because I would hate to see the UN and the West lying in order to try and manufacture public support for the overthrow of their political and economic enemies. Alright everyone, I hope you liked this video. Fun little video, kind of in the style of my TikToks, but longer and more put together, more editing, so more time consuming, but I'm banned from TikTok right now, so hey, I'll just do these for a while. Alright, hope everyone liked this. Let me know in the comments what you thought. Peace!